Welcome to our webinar today about effective project-level grievance mechanisms in a changing landscape, an interactive tool. My name is Tanya Frazier, and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA, in partnership with IAIA's Washington Area Branch, or WAB. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessments to make informed decisions. This webinar was intended for a more localized audience, but due to the global pandemic, the Washington Area Branch offered to make it broadly available due to its applicability around the world. Today's webinar is a part of a series of webinars offered by IAIA, and I invite you to visit our website and check out the recordings of a few of our recent topics. All of these that are listed, as well as new webinars like Understanding Impact Assessment, Species Environmental Assessment, Air Quality, Microplastics, and many more. If you are enjoying the webinar as you watch and would like to comment on social media, feel free to use the handles at IAIA Network or hashtag IAIA Webinar. A few points of housekeeping. On the right hand of your screen, you will see a control panel, and in that control panel, there is an orange or red arrow at the top. That is the button that you can push to swoop the control panel out of your view, so you're able to view the screen and the slide in its entirety. If you'd like to swoop it back in, you use the exact same arrow. This presentation will be recorded and will be made available afterwards, as well as a copy of the slides for your access. This will be a 60-minute webinar with 15 minutes for questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them during the presentation in the questions section of the control panel. I will be moderating those questions throughout and will be proctoring those questions during the Q&A section. The slides are also available in the control panel under the Handouts tab if you'd like to print them out and follow along or take notes. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter. Our presenter today is Elizabeth Mensah. Elizabeth works as an advisory specialist for the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman Office, or the CAO, of the World Bank Group, or WBG, an independent accountability mechanism for the private sector lending arms, IFC-MIGA, of the WBG. In this role, Elizabeth is actively engaged with communities from a policy perspective, working to provide independent advice with the goal of improving the environmental and social outcomes of IFC and MIGA projects around the world. Before joining CAO, Elizabeth's work and research focused on the intersection between the development and conflict in Africa, particularly around the role of tribal governance systems. Elizabeth sits on the board of an award-winning Ghanaian NGO whose focus is on peace building, health, and integrated sustainable development. She holds dual Ghanaian and Canadian citizenships and has a PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. And with that, I turn over the presentation to Elizabeth. Have fun.
Great, thanks so much, Tanya, and thanks to the Washington Area Branch for putting this presentation more broadly to everyone else. Really excited to be here today. My colleague Julia and I are both on the line, although I get the pleasure of sitting in front of the camera. Julia is here as a team member both from the advisory team of our office, but also dispute resolution. So she has some hands-on experience during our Q&A time that I think will be useful. And she's also here to jump in case my 2-year-old coworker happens to wake up early from his nap. So I'm just really glad to be here today and genuinely excited and in some ways a bit overwhelmed by the incredible response we've received around this webinar, and also just the incredible level of expertise, varying range of knowledge, and the hunger for this topic. It's been a passion of mine at the time that I've worked at CAO to sort of think about grievance mechanisms. But I think we're also here today because we're at an interesting and important moment in global history. We're dealing with a global pandemic, which has really changed the way we do impact assessment and the work that we do with communities on the ground. And we're also seeing globally, I think, a push towards people's voices being heard and grievances being taken up. And so I think that in many ways, it's a poignant and timely opportunity for us to discuss this. And I hope we do it justice, recognizing we've got an hour and there's so much to cover. But Julia and I are, of course, available after this webinar to be there to speak to you and talk through some of these things if you're interested. But really just glad to be here and hope that this presentation is going to be useful in the work that you do. And so just to give a really quick lay of the land, I like to try and speak less so that we have more time for questions. I think that's where discussion ends up being most rich. So what I'm going to do is just give a background of who we are, what CAO is a little bit, and why we're doing this work on grievance mechanisms or have done this work on grievance mechanisms, and then just try and dive into this toolkit. I recognize from a lot of the feedback that we received that people have very specific questions, and I think in the time that we have to cover all of the permutations and challenges of this work around grievance mechanisms is tricky, but this toolkit is meant to try and help folks deal with a lot of the issues that you raise, and hopefully we'll be able to touch on a smattering of some of the key challenges as we move through this presentation. So just a little bit of background on who we are as an office. CAO is the, as Tanya mentioned, the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, which is the independent accountability mechanism for IFC and MIGA, which are the private sector lending arms of the World Bank. We are grievance mechanisms ourselves. We address complaints from project-affected communities. And in the advisory role, which is where Julia and I work, there are 3 roles as part of our office. One that takes complaints and addresses them between communities and companies through a dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution. Another arm of our office works at looking at those complaints that we receive, how they have adhered from a compliance standpoint. And so that we have those 2 sort of outward facing arms, the dispute resolution and the compliance, that address complaints from community affected people. And then there's the 3rd arm, which is the advisory role, which is where Julia and I predominantly work, although Julia does work with a dispute resolution team as well. And that looks at trying to affect institutional change through learning from our cases. So how do we take what we know of community grievances around IFC or MIGA projects and feed them back into both IFC and MIGA, the World Bank, but just more broadly, how do we learn from some of the things that we see from the cases that CAO receives? And so one of the things that we certainly have noticed in our years working around this issue, as you can imagine, is just the importance of grievance mechanisms. And again, I know that in some ways I'm preaching to the choir. We've had about 1,000 people show up for this, so I know that folks recognize the importance of grievance mechanisms. But I think it is good to sort of conceptualize the fact that this has been something that is more broadly thought about than even just sort of in the public sector realm that we think about. Although the human rights, the United Nations and the pillars of the guiding principles on business and human rights really speak to this concept of access to remedy and corporate social responsibility for accessing human rights. So there's a broad discussion about the importance of grievance mechanisms, whether you're dealing with public sector or whether you're dealing with private sector. And we know that grievance mechanisms are important for many reasons, but 3 of the key ones that I just want to highlight today are just that they're an important part of ongoing stakeholder engagement. And I think often the perception of sort of grievance mechanisms being a discrete entity or unit within a company or project implementer doesn't help us to recognize that they are part of a broader ecosystem of remedy and corporate responsibility, or even just general sort of responsiveness around project implementation. And also, in being part of an ecosystem, they allow both the project implementer as well as communities to develop a really collaborative risk assessment system. And I think often we sort of have a bit of a, we try and set up a bit of a false dichotomy between sort of what a grievance mechanism is as far as its usefulness, being something that communities are able to bring grievances to companies, but companies and project implementers are often really benefit from the information that communities at the project level can provide when it comes to some of the challenges and issues, real time, at the point of contact. And I think it's really good to think about grievance mechanisms within that ecosystem as being a win-win for both companies and for communities. And it also provides the opportunity to address issues early. And I think we all know that being able to address conflict as it arises is such a critical component to being able to use that knowledge to address issues through project design and implementation. So grievance mechanisms are important. We all know that grievance mechanisms are important. We all know that smart people have been thinking about this. So why did CAO decide that we wanted to dive into this? And we noticed a gap. We recognize that so much of the literature and the work that's being done around grievance mechanisms has really focused very heavily on large companies with possibly much deeper pockets and much bigger margins than a lot of other sectors, and particularly in extractives. But we all, and especially from the feedback again that we received in preparation for today, we all know that grievances look very different when they're in different contexts. If you're doing agribusiness or you're working in the agribusiness field, planting, spraying, harvesting, those are times where you're going to see a spike in grievances. And I love this graph, or this chart rather, because it really helps us to recognize that having a one-size-fits-all grievance mechanism model that is designed around big companies or deep pockets isn't going to be as useful or effective for companies of different sizes and in different sectors. So we found that there was a gap there, and we also felt that there was a lot of great theory and information out there, but it was often pretty dense and a little bit inaccessible. And so we wanted to do something that actually really met the needs of different contexts, different people, different places, and made this really important work more accessible. And so this is our toolkit. This is the homepage of our toolkit. And I want to just point out that if anyone is interested, and I hope you can see the web link here, but it's cao-grm.org, and it's available if you go to the top here in English, Spanish, and French. So for those of you who prefer to follow along in those languages, please feel free to do so. You can do that online. I'll be obviously speaking in English and going through the tools in English, but they're available in different languages. But this toolkit, again, was designed to try and be something that provided accessible tools and accessible theory around grievance mechanisms to a broad range of contexts. So while we recognize it's not a panacea for everything related to grievance mechanisms, what it does do really well is prompt important questions that help implementers in different contexts know what they might need to address their unique challenges. It's also accessible, and I think especially during COVID-19, we recognize we could do more thinking around technology, but having something that's online that you can download some of these key tools, I think is really, really critical. And it's accessible both from sort of a web platform base, but it's also accessible from a theory base. We've tried to distill it into ideas and concepts that are easy to grasp and that can be modeled and molded to make it fit for purpose for program implementers that are trying to put in a trusted and effective grievance mechanism. And it also helps put tools in the hands of people to skill up capacity around grievance mechanisms for implementers that maybe have small margins and don't think this is a really good use of their resources, and who maybe aren't really convinced that this is actually something that's useful for both them and for the communities that they work with. So I think what I'd like to do in the time that we've got remaining here is I would like to just do a little bit of a snapshot on some of the key points or the key nuggets that I think would be useful to highlight, particularly given the feedback that we've received from folks today, and hopefully provide some to whet your appetite for some of the other tools that we have in this kit. So just want to highlight that if you're on the navigation page, we're first going to just talk a little bit about purpose, design, and implementation, which is a drop-down menu online, and we'll also be talking about the tools and resources quickly after that. So purpose, design, and implementation. This is what I like to call the distill theory section. And what we try and do in walking through the purpose and the goals of this toolkit is especially focus on the business case, because one of the things that we learned as we were developing this from experts and from folks working around grievance mechanisms is that it's often hard to try and convince people or companies, implementers with small margins, with limited resources, that the grievance mechanisms are a good use of those resources. And granted that this figure is from the extractive industries, but the University of Melbourne Shift and the Kennedy School put out a bit of research that said that conflict can cost companies in the extractive industry up to $20 million a week. It's a lot of resources that could be put to better use. And while we are still trying to develop a better body of work around what that figure looks like for different industries, I think one of the things that we really wanted to highlight is that grievance mechanisms and having good grievance mechanisms is really an important part of actually resource conservation and being able to use it for important things. So in section 2, we talk a lot about the myth busting around grievance mechanisms. One of my favorites that we tackle is that advertising, and this is something that we heard, that advertising a grievance mechanism is actually not a good thing to do because you get too many grievances. And when you get too many grievances, you send a bad signal around poor performance, and you send a bad signal to external shareholders if you're in the private sector, but external interested stakeholders that there's poor performance. And so we addressed that one particular myth by going through sort of why having a well-articulated grievance mechanism that is actually communicated well means that you know what's going on, that you're aware of what's going on at the project level, and actually it sends a signal that you're responsive, and decreases conflict and the cost of conflict over time. So that's one of the things that you can look for in sort of that section number 2 on why grievance mechanisms are a good company investment. We really try and spend time going through a lot of the myths that you hear around grievance mechanisms not being a good investment. The other section I want to highlight is section 4, and again, there's good stuff everywhere, but given a limited time, I want to just focus on some of my favorites. Section 4 on building a good grievance mechanism, and this is really in response to, again, a lot of the feedback that we got in preparation for today around how you build a good grievance mechanism in different contexts. And I think the strength of this section is the fact that there are 4 very clear, simple key steps around how you build a grievance mechanism that allow you to make that process very fit for purpose. And what it does is it sort of walks you through what are some of the key questions that you need to ask around identifying the key actors. What does your current environment look like? What is the scope of your grievance mechanism going to look like? And what are the purpose and goals of that grievance mechanism going to look like? And each one of those are broken down sort of in a series of thought-provoking questions on what are the sorts of things that you're going to want to ask? Who are the sorts of people that you're going to want to talk to? And I think that's really helpful because, again, this question about fit for purpose, how do we make sure that we're building a grievance mechanism that's appropriate for the scale and the size of the project or program that we're implementing? So I think that's a really useful place, particularly for people who are starting this and are dealing with clients or companies or program operators who are new to this. It's a really useful first guide into what are some of the critical and basic components of a grievance mechanism, which is then followed on in section 5 with an expanded flow diagram of grievance handling. And this is one of the components of section 5 that I think is also very useful in light of feedback. The expanded flow diagram, I think the beauty of this and what is useful about this is that it takes a lot of the theory and collapses it into something that is manageable for people who are, again, new to this and maybe don't need a bigger, more complex grievance mechanism given the size and scale of their operations. And so this expanded flow diagram walks you through what are some of the key elements of responding to grievance mechanism or responding to grievances. How do you do that well? How do you assess a grievance mechanism appropriately? How do you manage and deal with the grievance mechanism appropriately? What do you do if the management or the solution to the grievance mechanism that's been mutually agreed upon isn't to the satisfaction of the person who brought the grievance? And how do you deal with an appeals committee? And then how do you sort of close the loop around grievances? What are some of the key steps? And it breaks that down into components that I think are manageable. And for both section 4 and section 5, from a conceptual standpoint, I think the thing that I would really want to highlight is that the emphasis is on consultation, consultation, consultation. And I know that brings particular challenges right now as consultation is something that we think of being done face-to-face. And so it is something that we're thinking about how we can expand out the toolkit to think more about how do you do that well and appropriately in context of reprisals? How do you do that well in contexts where you're dealing with very remote communities that it's difficult to deal with? What are the different technologies and mechanisms that can be used to do it appropriately? So I think there is still some thinking to be done there, but I also think that there are some excellent ideas around how you communicate, how you address these concerns, or at least think through some of these concerns as you're looking for effective and appropriate ways to consult with the community, as well as internally with the program implementer, and if you're working in these types of contexts with contractors who are sort of often the secondary implementers of grievance mechanisms. And then finally, and this is my favorite chapter or favorite section, and maybe it's the nerd in me, but I love this section because I think to me this is maybe the most unique part of the work that we did and the thinking that we did around grievance mechanisms, was just thinking about how you use that grievance data around risk management. And I know that this is something that many people want to do, but it's often hard to do. And so in this section, there's a set of some again, simple questions to think about. How are you using your grievance data for risk management? How do you ask questions in senior management meetings on how many grievances you've received, what types of grievances you're dealing with, who and how well have they been addressed, how many grievances have been addressed, just key questions that can be fed back in to really help decision making. And this is one of my favorite sort of anecdotes as well around this work on the importance of that. But when you say, for example, get a complaint around trucks being driven too fast and in a local area, and people are really concerned about the safety around trucks being driven too fast, having a robust grievance mechanism can tell you whether it's one driver who is particularly lead-footed, or whether or not you actually have a problem with a whole fleet of drivers who haven't been trained appropriately. And the responses to both of those issues are going to be very different. And grievance mechanisms, appropriate grievance mechanisms, can really help to flush out that information and make decision making much more effective and bring in communities as a part of that collaborative way of thinking about grievance mechanisms for risk management. And so that's the theory section that we've got here that really takes you sort of from beginning to end and closing that loop around grievance mechanisms. What do we need to do to start it? What do we need to run it? And how do we use that information feed back into making better decisions and program implementation. But to back all of this theory up, again, as I mentioned, what we wanted to do was create a set of tools that were effective, that could be molded and could be used in each context. And so we have a set of Word documents that can be revised depending on what is needed. And I'm hopeful that I'll be able to share this with you. If not, I'll point you in the direction of the website. But each one of these provides a tool that allows whoever is using that tool to customize it in the way that they need it to be customized. And I'm just going to check with Tanya online to make sure that the Word document is actually visible.
Right now we are seeing the slide and not
Okay.
the Word doc, but we can make the Word doc available following the presentation. Oh, here comes the Word doc.
Great. Well, there we go. We figured it out. Here we go. Perfect. Thanks, Tanya. So this is an example. I'm going to just give a smattering of 2 or 3 examples on the types of tools that we've created to sort of back up the theory around this. So this grievance mechanism assessment tool is particularly useful for those of you who are assessing, I think, a grievance mechanism from a distance, who are experts in this field, who know a grievance mechanism, but just need a quick sort of diagnostic tool on what are some of, what is the state of play of the grievance mechanism you're dealing with. This was really informed by experts in the area on some of the top questions they ask. We know that it's been used to help companies improve grievance mechanisms. But this provides a set of questions that are really straightforward, but really help to drill down into some of the key issues that you'd want to look for. So for example, in question number 7 that you see here, how many grievances have you received in the last year? If, for example, you're dealing in an area that has, a context of conflict, that's dealing with legacy land issues, and you notice that there's a 0 here, there's no grievances in the past year, that's gonna have you ask questions. Is the grievance mechanism been published widely? Do people trust the grievance mechanism? But that's an area that you can hone in on, and it's a very quick 10 question or 11 question, 12 question questionnaire that can be sent to a company in advance of a discussion around what are the sorts of issues that they might be having with the grievance mechanism, and what are some of the areas where, as an expert, you could provide useful feedback to help improve a grievance mechanism. So that's one of the tools that's available there. Another one of the tools that we have that I'll try and pull up here as well is troubleshooting for grievance mechanisms. And this one is very long, and so I won't be able to go through all of it by any stretch. But what it does is it lays out a set of common questions and troubleshooting that we heard from experts, from communities, from people all over around some of their key problems with grievances, with implementing, designing, and developing grievance mechanisms, some of the key challenges or some of their key questions. It lays it out in what the questions were, what some of the options might be to address some of these key challenges, and then some resources that you might be able to find, or some of the resources that might help to then give more in-depth answers around some of these challenges, recognizing that there's good work out there and we didn't want to duplicate it. In particular, the IAIA toolkit on grievance mechanisms, while it is for the extractive sector, there are helpful things like a community grievance mechanism log that's there. There's also how to implement community grievance mechanisms, some tips on engaging external stakeholders. So what we really tried to do is condense it into an easy to use format on some of the key questions that we noticed around grievance mechanisms. And then I think I'll just quickly go to this section here, just the case study. Oh, actually, I'll just highlight this. I won't pull it open, but this is also another tool that we developed, which is actually just a template for a community grievance mechanism procedure. And I think this was something that we had heard calls for from a lot of people who are working in this area, because it's very difficult to start from scratch if you're new to this topic without some sort of an idea of what a grievance mechanism ought to look like in practice. And so again, if you go online, you can pull this, you can download it, you can customize it to the context based on the conversations that you've had and consultation that you've had. And finally, I'll just go to this case study here, just so that you can get a taste of what the case studies are like, because I think this is also something that we really heard calls for around people having particular issues on particular types of sectors or particular types of issues. What do we do? And do you have any examples of? And so we have a number of different examples in different sectors with different sizes of companies, different types of issues, all of them fictionalized to protect the situation, but all based on real examples of what people did to resolve challenges around grievance mechanisms. And I think this is particularly helpful when you're dealing with companies who say, you know, well, I'm in agriculture, and it's really small scale farming, and we're dealing with small scale farmers, and I'm just not really sure about some of the challenges that we're having right now with grazing rights. Do you have any examples of how people have dealt with this sort of thing before? So we've tried to give a good breadth to some of those sectors and issues, and really hope that has been a useful tool to again emphasize the importance of grievances, but also the usefulness of case studies in helping people to understand how to implement grievance mechanisms. So that's what I have for you folks now on my end. I've done quite a bit of talking, and I wanted to leave room for questions. So I think we have time now to go to questions, Tanya, if we're ready. And look forward to hearing some thoughts from you folks. The only thing that before we do go to questions, Tanya, that I'd like to just mention is that we have a survey at the back of, or on the front of the toolkit, that is voluntary, but it really helps us to think about some of the key challenges that you have in implementing grievance mechanisms. And if we were to revise this toolkit, what are some of the things that you would like to see that would make your work easier, that would make your work more effective, and also just to give us an idea of who's using the toolkit and how useful you found it. So if you would take that survey, that would be really helpful for us in improving what we do and what we can offer as we think about trying to provide more information with the work that you folks are doing, and trying to be supportive from the knowledge that we've gained in our casework over the years. So Tanya, with that, I think I'll hand it back to you for questions.
Sounds great. We've got some really wonderful questions here. And let's start with the first one. Kate asks, would you recommend having different grievance mechanisms for internal, such as employees, and external stakeholders separately?
So that's one of the things that we've often had questions. It's actually something we've had a lot of questions around. And yes, I think there is clear evidence that there are different modalities for grievance mechanisms, community level grievance mechanisms and internal grievance mechanisms within an organization. But this is something that we have, the internal grievance mechanism is something that we haven't really covered in this toolkit. It's very community focused and community based. And so I think the usefulness of this toolkit is focused there, but the labor side of things, the internal grievance mechanism, is something that we've thought about as a build out to this toolkit.
Wonderful. Next question comes from Ilko, and the question is, Can this toolkit also be used for projects in OECD countries and urban areas?
Yes, absolutely. I think the purpose is definitely to provide accessible theory and accessible tools. And so there's examples from, one of the examples is from a highly industrialized area. How do you deal with grievances when you have several companies that are side by side and you're getting grievances around pollution, for example? Who's responsible? How do you deal with a grievance mechanism? So this is absolutely applicable to different circumstances like that.
Fantastic. Next question comes from Nadiga. And the question is, what do you do if local populations don't want to use the GM, but prefer to use only oral or informal ways?
So this is an interesting, a great question, interesting question. And it's one of the things that we really spend a lot of time in our theory section discussing. And this is on the issue of ensuring that the type of grievance mechanism that you build is a grievance mechanism that is going to be effective based on the type of context that you're in, which requires consultation. So if you do have a community that prefers to bring grievances orally, or prefers to bring grievances informally, how are you going to maybe have an internal structure for receiving those things so that you can be predictable, so that you can be effective in responding to those, but also being aware of the fact that there are going to be multiple ways in which you receive grievances. That's a very natural part of the grievance handling process. And if there are multiple, it's actually one of the things that we suggest even in the communication is having different avenues, but making sure that there's someone who owns that within the implementer, whoever is setting up the grievance toolkit, making sure that there is internal ownership, there is structure around it, especially from the owner of the grievances perspective, and also just ensuring that that you are being sensitive to the different ways in which people bring grievances. I think that's what makes a grievance mechanism effective, is making sure that you are getting the breadth of issues rather than limiting to particular channels, particularly if you're noticing over time that those channels are not actually ones that people feel comfortable, safe, trusted in using. So again, back to that sort of point on, make sure you're doing consultation around what people feel comfortable and how people feel comfortable bringing grievances to ensure that this actually is something that's going to be effective.
Great answer. Next question comes from Olivia. Is there information or guidance on how to estimate the cost of addressing grievances?
Oh, Olivia, this is a great question, and a lot of really smart people have done thinking about this. Again, I mentioned the Kennedy School report that the Kennedy School, University of Melbourne, and SHIFT, S-H-I-F-T, and it's a reference that we make in the toolkit, so you can go there if you're interested in this study. But this is something that's challenging, and part of the reason that it's challenging, I think, is in order to do that, in order to do a lot of that work, grievances need to be published. And there's, for transparency reasons, for confidentiality reasons, for corporate reasons, often sort of the breadth of grievances are not always something that's published by different companies. And in doing the research around this toolkit, we went to different companies to look at what we would perceive to be sort of number of grievances, cost of grievances, and there's not a lot of, although it's growing, information around that. So I don't have a good answer for you there. I'm afraid it is a body of work that I think we're thinking about, but something that I think still has to, as grievance mechanisms get more traction and as there's more transparency around grievances, I think that becomes something that's easier to do.
Great. Candace asks, part of my job is investigating environmental complaints. How would you approach assessing grievances or complaints that are made out of spite against a company?
That's a challenging question. I think and one that I'm not sure I can sort of effectively answer, because I think it comes back to some of the discussion that we had earlier around what are you perceiving to be the scope? What are you perceiving? What are you and the community perceiving to be the scope? What are you and the community that you're working with, if you are the grievance handler, perceiving to be the goals and the objectives of a grievance mechanism? If your goals and objectives are to hear from people and to digest what the issues are, I think there also needs to be an internal process where there are conflicts, and it is useful to know what type of conflicts you're dealing with, or what type of concerns people raise. But I think this toolkit certainly doesn't deal with the motivation behind complaints, and so it's a bit more of a challenging, I think, challenging response. But I'll actually ask my colleague Julia if she has any thoughts on that one.
Hi, thanks, Elizabeth. I think that's a really difficult question to answer. It's definitely one that comes up a lot. In our experience in dealing with grievances directly, we might quite often hear this is a politically motivated grievance, or it's a spiteful grievance. If you look at grievance handling as a part of risk management, then there's a good reason, rationale behind engaging with all complaints at face value, and no matter what you might think the motivations are, still thinking about what's actually being complained about and taking it at face value. Quite often the initial sort of sense that maybe there was a different motivation does fall away, and sometimes it doesn't. So if you have a situation where the trust is broken down so much that anything that it can no longer be dealt with through a grievance mechanism, then maybe you're dealing with a bigger problem, right? So a grievance mechanism is part of a larger continuum of engagements with your community, with your neighbors. And if trust is broken down so much that that a grievance mechanism can't handle, or gets overwhelmed with what feels like spiteful grievances, then maybe there's something more you need to do in terms of outreach, in terms of relationship building, and in the sort of more challenging context that might even involve bringing in a third-party neutral, some dispute resolution work, that might then be beyond the scope of what a grievance mechanism by itself can deliver. But in my personal experience, quite a lot of the time, hardworking company people that have done a really good faith effort to try and do the best they can in addressing grievances, and then there's still complaints, might experience something as spiteful, and yet there might still be real substance to the concern. So it's actually worth, in the first instance, just to try and step away from the emotions that are involved and just try and look at face value. Is there something that can be addressed? And oftentimes just addressing the issues at face value, being good about reporting back, saying we've heard these issues, this is what's been done in aggregate, maybe can build the kind of trust that reduces noise in the system and brings it back to what might be a reasonable number of grievances that you would expect. I hope that addresses the question.
Thanks, Julia.
Wonderful collaboration, you two. Next question comes from Elizabeth. Which KPIs do you suggest for monitoring and reporting?
I'm not sure that can I get a little bit more information on the question? I feel like I need a little bit more background on that.
Perfect. Elizabeth, if you could type in a little bit more, we'll come back to this one. But if you can share a little bit more about what you're needing there, we'll be looking for your response. Next question comes from Julie. Does CAO have any guidance in terms of what context, when you're using a third-party service provider for grievance handling, is recommended or appropriate, and any guidance as to how to assess or vet potential third-party providers?
That's an excellent question. This is certainly not something that we deal with in the toolkit on how to assess third-party providers. And I'm not sure that, again, I think this is also sort of contextual on whether or not third-party providers have a track record of being trusted in a particular area, whether or not third-party providers are they have the sort of the background and the capabilities to implement. But I think especially I would sort of place the emphasis on is this third-party provider somebody who is known to be a trusted provider, and also is this entity known to be or have a track record of good stakeholder engagement, because fundamentally I think you're going to want to make sure that who you're dealing with in this instance is someone that is sort of capable in that area. But I recognize that this is actually a much more detailed conversation, so possibly one that we could take offline.
Wonderful. Question, do you think, let's go to, I'm sorry, to this one. Oh, there's been multiple questions regarding small businesses. How can a grievance mechanism work without having a community liaison officer? It's not always easy to afford a full-time CLO.
Yeah, that's great. Great question. One we've again thought quite a bit about, and so one of the tools in there is actually sort of thinking through what do you do when you don't have the money for or the resources for a full-time person. So part of it is making sure at a minimum that you have ownership within the company, and perhaps it is identifying somebody within or implementer within the implementation unit that has ownership over the grievances, that is identifiable, that is a clearly identified person that may have more than one job. And there is a section around sort of roles and responsibilities. How do you sort of know what a person, what qualifications you're looking for in that person? What are the sorts of characteristics that you'd want from somebody who might be playing dual roles, and also just thinking through what it would mean to have potentially an appeals process, or thinking through what it would mean to have other people within the organization be alongside to support, while still providing sort of clear, transparent, predictable processes that are owned by particular company members. But again, there's a section on that around how you build a grievance mechanism, and also a tool on roles and responsibilities that I think would be helpful to as you think through that question.
Great. Elizabeth gave us a little more information regarding her question. She said we need to report on grievances, and classically it is the NB of grievances as an example, and this means nothing. We should prefer the timing for the resolution, the level of satisfaction, so which pertinent KPIs that we should focus on?
That's a question that I think I would probably like. Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. That gives you a lot more clarity. I think that's one that I would like to. I could more easily answer, I think, offline, to think about what those would be specifically, because I think again that's a contextual. That's also a contextual type of answer. Although I think especially for CAO, we've done a lot of thinking around how we measure it from sort of our perspective as a grievance mechanism in our monitoring, and thinking through issues like, as you've mentioned, satisfaction, issues around timeliness, issues around sort of trustedness, like are there metrics for measuring trust? Have you thought through what those metrics might look like? But again, there's also some useful nuggets in that chapter 6 that I won't go into in detail that would be useful, I think, in thinking about the types of questions that you want those metrics to answer. And so I think that without knowing your context, without knowing the sorts of things that you're dealing with, that would be sort of the point, but happy to chat offline about that.
Thank you for that willingness. All right, we've got a question from Kevin. He asked, has CAO done any analysis on the cost benefit of implementing a grievance mechanism versus not having one, such as avoidance of lawsuits, less work interruptions, etc.?
The short answer is we haven't done anything. No, the short answer is no, but we have done thinking around the cost of conflict, and we're working on more thinking around the cost of conflict, because we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence, again, but then also back to the shift example that I gave earlier, but nothing that is sort of aggregated around the cost of conflict. But I think that's that's work that's being done out there, and I think something that we've thought about trying to find ways of articulating what the cost of conflict is, but not work that we have done. No.
Great. There are so many amazing questions. It is very challenging to pick which ones to read out here. So know that all of your questions will be forwarded to Elizabeth to be able to take a peek at those. She won't be able to refer to all of them. They will all be seen at some juncture. Next question comes from Martin. How do you handle grievance that's aimed at third parties that are not cooperative, such as the government, other lenders, or next door project?
These are all very easy questions to answer, Tanya. I think I'm grateful for the ones that you're picking out. They're all very easy. I'm going to also punt to Julia for this one after I give a broad overview, because she's dealt with this in different circumstances. The probably unsatisfactory answer is around that consultation piece, and in a couple of instances when I've been dealing with this, especially the question around sort of if you're a private sector entity working in a situation where there's a lot of grievances around things that actually are government driven and you're having challenges sort of pulling people in, how do you do that? And I don't actually think that there is an easy answer, although I think that there have been some good thinking, and again, I'll pull Julia in on this as well. But thinking again in that initial sort of engagement phase, particularly as you define scope and as you define goals and outcomes of a grievance mechanism, with a local community, because I think often part of the challenge and the conflict that comes around that are expectations. If there are expectations that a grievance mechanism is going to solve problems that fundamentally a third party who should be involved or maybe needs to be involved, but there are challenges around that, really having an open and clear discussion about how those are going to be dealt with, where the responsibility lies for that, in the stakeholder engagement, sort of figuring out what can be done when there isn't as much participation as maybe is needed to resolve some of these issues. And I again, I don't think I have it's such a difficult question. It's one that we get so often. It's one that we deal with, but I think it does require, again, sort of in that initial consultation, and if it's past the initial consultation, trying to find champions, trying to build champions within that sort of third party to bring into the system, whether through tripartite systems where you have multiple people sitting on a board. If they're not interested, trying to find different ways of providing incentives for participation. But this is a challenging question, and I think one that we do get a lot, and something that I'll also punt to Julia to see if there's anything she wants to add there.
So I would just add, and Elizabeth has already mentioned quite a few avenues. I would just add that if the resolution to the concerns and maybe the source of the concerns is clearly not in the company's control, of course that's extremely frustrating when people still come to you with a grievance and see you as somebody that should be able to address them, right? Again, it might be a little bit beyond the scope of a grievance mechanism, but if you see that coming again and again in your grievance mechanism, that you have grievances that are actually out of your control and that are in a third party's hand, that calls for a bigger stakeholder engagement, right? So if you're having an engagement with your community, if it's very conflictual, maybe with third party support, identifying what the issues are jointly and who is responsible for what, and getting a common understanding and a shared understanding around whose responsibility is to take care of each type of issues can already go a long way towards diffusing some of the anger and frustration that you otherwise will feel at the operating level. So that would be definitely a worthwhile investment. And then yes, once you have that joint understanding, there are things that people can do to then bring in those third parties. A jointly formulated letter or approach to that third party saying, we are seeking your support in addressing some of these issues at a more substantial level, so that these grievances don't come up anymore, might go much further than if a community member by themselves approach a company or a government entity. So there are approaches. When it gets complicated, I would always recommend the use of a third-party neutral. But yeah, it's hard to do that in the context of a grievance mechanism. It might be one of those situations where the grievances coming through the mechanism highlight a bigger issue that needs to be picked up.
Great.
Wonderful answer. Next from Kristan, what are the best practices in handling confidential grievances?
That is a very good question, and one that we talk a little bit about in the toolkit as well, around how you receive confidential and how do you deal with anonymity. How do you deal, particularly for us in our work in context of reprisals, how do you deal with it with maybe Indigenous peoples or other groups that want to keep their work or their grievances confidential? I think, again, and I find this, I always find this answer challenging, but I think, again, it comes to engagement, and it comes to stakeholder engagement around where do people feel safe bringing grievances. And so it's again a context specific issue. Perhaps in some instances there are certain local channels where people feel comfortable being confidential. They feel that particular space is trusted. Perhaps in some instances it's having encrypted WhatsApp. Perhaps in some cases it's having a place or a space where people are able to go in a forum that provides a certain level of anonymity. But I think it really depends on the context that you're operating in, and that's why consultation at the very beginning or even throughout the process around stakeholder engagement helps to know where people feel confident, and also if people feel confident that when you say, we will keep your complaint in confidence because you've brought it to us in confidence in a modality that you find safe, then demonstrating, I think, being very clear and being very conscious and being very careful to demonstrate that confidentiality is held. And so I think, again, it is a contextual thing because people need to feel safe bringing it. It is in some ways non-contextual because part of the responsibility then is on the grievance holder to demonstrate that trust is warranted. And so I think in some ways it's a bit of a two-part answer. Again, Julia, I don't know if you have anything to add here. If you want to, Julia also has the responsibility of leading and dealing with our reprisals work. So she's done quite a bit of thinking about confidentiality and reprisals. So I don't know, Julia, if you have anything to add here.
Yeah, I would just say, well, watch the space. We are thinking about the sort of grievance mechanism toolkit 2.0, where we account for the context of the shrinking civil society space, and of course, in the context of reprisals, confidentiality is a big deal, and it's one of the things that you do have under control as a grievance mechanism. So increasingly, grievance mechanisms are making anonymous channels available. Of course, that has some limitations as to what you can actually do when you don't know where the grievance comes from, but it still can help provide very important information. There are things you can do to help influence your operating environment. So if as a company, as an operator, you make it very clear through your public communications that you welcome grievances, that it's okay to be having concerns about the project and that's actually helpful to the company, then you can create an environment where the confidentiality may not even be as necessary, and the concerns are lowered by people. But absolutely, once you provide confidential channels, which is a good idea, or even anonymous channels. But if you provide confidential channels, those have to be really well guarded in terms of how you deal with digital security, how you're keeping those records. And if there are specific issues related to people raising concern about specific company staff, then it's very, very important that the confidentiality of this information and of who has raised a complaint, be it a female member of the community feeling harassed by a male staff of the company or that kind of thing. Of course, if that confidential information is not guarded, then you are really breaching not just the trust of the community, but you're actively endangering a complainant, right? So it's very, very important to safeguard. And there are ways of doing that in terms of how you engage with people, the channels that you're opening up, the digital security, and your internal information management systems that are properly secured.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both ladies for your amazing responses. There are so many questions that we are not able to get to today, but a giant thank you to everyone who took the time to ask a question and to be actively engaged in this presentation today. Well, as we wrap up the presentation, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you to our presenter, Elizabeth, and her wonderful colleague, Julia, for all of the work that they've done, and to the WAB for the hard work that they did in aligning and connecting these two organizations to be able to provide this workshop. A little information on what else you can access in the world of IAIA. We have webinars on demand, which are multiple years of archived webinars. So feel free to go view those. There is an online professional development program with a mentorship component. The next course will begin in September, so watch for that. We have an annual IAIA conference with pre-conference trainings that are rich. Next year's will be in Seville, Spain. This year, because of the COVID rescheduling of our conference, we will be holding an online symposium in October of 2020, and watch for information in the coming days and weeks regarding the theme and content for that presentation. And finally, that there are a variety of resources regarding best practice principles, IA FAST tips, and more. So for more information on what both IAIA and the WAB provide, here are the websites for you to be able to go and explore. Thank you again for your time today, and I wish you all well as you continue in the rest of your day. Thanks again for coming, and have a good one.